What can we expect in 2024? I've spent 15 years in private equity and mergers and acquisitions. While you can't come to me for everything, that is one topic area where I have a bit of experience. Stay tuned today to hear about our tailwinds, headwinds, and where that really puts us for 2024. First, let's start with the tailwinds as it relates to M&A. As everyone knows, we're in a demographic situation where there are a lot of folks that are getting close or already in retirement, at retirement age, or perhaps, according to some folks, beyond retirement age. For that reason, there are going to be a lot of sellers, especially because we're getting through the very turbulent times of the pandemic era. During the pandemic era, I think a lot of folks just wanted to sit on the sidelines, get through it, and see how they came out on the other side. Well, we're out, and while there still are some of the challenges that remain from the pandemic era, a lot of businesses, generally speaking, are doing well. We've been hearing for a long time how a recession is coming and how we need to batten down the hatches and whatnot. And, for some industries and certainly for some people, it has been a challenging period economically. However, a lot of businesses that we see, as well as public companies, are doing really well. For that reason, you got a lot of folks that are approaching retirement age or at retirement age looking to exit. You got businesses doing well. Those two things lead to what you might expect to be a pretty healthy M&A environment. In terms of headwinds, I would say there is really one thing that always presents challenges or decreases folks' appetite for M&A, and that's uncertainty. I think there are two types of uncertainty that are front and center as it relates to M&A. As it relates to macroeconomic uncertainty, we all know or have a feel for some of the driving factors. We have inflation that appears to be leveling off. We have interest rates that are largely being raised and impacted because of inflation. And in concert with that, we have recession fears. And these aren't three independent issues. They all factor in together. But again, uncertainty. On top of all that macroeconomic uncertainty is political uncertainty, especially in the US. Look at what's going on right now. You have an incumbent president who is polling very poorly. You have a former president who is polling very well. However, he is a very divisive figure, with many people in the Republican Party really trying to do anything they can to get someone other than him to be the party's representative for president, and not just at the level of president. I mean, look what's going on in the House of Representatives,
where members have just voted to expel New York Republican George Santos from Congress. Expulsions from the House are extremely rare. This is just the sixth time in history of the American democracy, and the third time since the Civil War.
So we've talked about tailwinds, we've talked about headwinds. What's staying the same? Well, first is that private equity firms continue to have dry powder to transact. Given that many firms have completed their fundraising process years before, just because we're facing some uncertainty or whatever, doesn't mean that dry powder goes away. I think certainly in the future, that story is going to change, because right now there's been a lot of press about how it's been challenging for private equity firms to raise for new funds. But again, right now, the amount of capital that private equity firms have in the market is always going to be a driver of M&A, even though private equity firms are just one class of buyer. What's also remaining the same is that the growth is challenging. Right now, labor is challenging. It's more challenging now than before. Speaking about that uncertainty, talking about the advent of AI and how there's reshoring and supply chain issues and whatnot. So even though businesses are doing well, there are definitely challenges to maintaining the success and perhaps even trying to build on that. I think companies are going to be able to achieve growth, but they're going to have to be creative, and it's going to be the excellent operators that are achieving growth, not just anybody because they're in an industry that's doing well. So what's the end result? Before we get to that, I need to get to the real boring part of this video, and I'm sorry if you've stayed awake this long. Hats off to you, but looking at the entire M&A universe is helpful. It's good to see some trends about average transaction prices and how many deals and the size of deals. But when you think about how the world actually operates for you or for your firm, it's a very small subset of that entire population of transactions and whatnot. And what's interesting is a lot of folks that are newer to the industry really want me to overgeneralize certain trends or topics or whatever. And what I tell them is that one of the key learnings that I've had in being in this business for as long as I have is that it's a real risk to overgeneralize. There can be a period where very few deals are coming to the market, but it just so happens that you have a few that you're working on and the timing just works out for you. Even though I like to look at the trends and I like to think about those, it's very random in terms of when we see deals, how we see deals, and what we expect to pay for those deals. With that large and overdone disclaimer, I would say the primary takeaway that we're seeing right now is that there is some evidence for a widening gap between sellers' expectations in terms of transaction values and what buyers are willing to pay to sell it for more than a buyer is willing to pay. But, generally speaking, the companies are doing well and sellers want to be compensated for that. Additionally, in this period of inflation, I'm not saying everyone feels this way, but, some of the buyers that I've talked to have been of the mindset that it's like, hey, listen, I'm paying more for everything, for all the input that I need in order to, make the products that I make or provide the services. If I have to pay more for everything, then whenever I sell my business, I'm going to sell it for more because we're in an inflationary environment. Generally speaking, even if there's inflation for raw goods and raw materials, that's not going to carry over into increased multiples for businesses and whatnot. But I would say on the buyer side, it's less about buyer psyche and whatnot and more about market fundamentals. Typically speaking, I think most private equity firms are going to have target IRRs or target multiples on invested capital. And in order to hit those, it assumes a certain level of debt and it also assumes a certain level of interest being paid on that debt. Now, it's easy to see that in a rising interest rate environment, in order to maintain the same returns for the private equity firm, there's going to be less debt. And again, if they're trying to hit the normal returns, then that leads to lower debt, same equity, lower transaction multiple. So it's not quite that simple, but if you believe the idea that the gap between seller and buyer expectations is widening, then those are some of the reasons why that might in fact be the case. After that video, I think you might have an idea as to why I call myself the most boring guy in private equity. But all joking aside, subscribe to the channel because we'll be doing quarterly updates on the market, so you won't want to miss that. Because as well as I do, the market changes rapidly and it doesn't really wait for us to respond.